Okay, so we're back looking at our analysis of A Christmas Carol, and this time we're looking at page 6. Okay, so you need to make sure that you've got page 6, and remember they're the notes that we made last time. So we're going to start here with this bit about the description of London. You should already have that written in from last time, but if not, write it there or write it here at the top of the page. Where you've got space, write it nice and big so that at any point you can come and find this section again, because this description of London, I think, is really, really important actually. So let's have a look then. So let's read through it first. It says, meanwhile the fog and darkness thickened so that people ran about with flaring links, proffering their services to go before horses in carriages and conduct them on their way. The ancient tower of a church, whose gruff old bell was always peeping slyly down at Scrooge out of a Gothic window in the wall, became invisible, and struck the hours and quarters in the clouds with tremulous vibrations afterwards, as if its teeth were chattering in its frozen head up there. The cold became intense. So we've got a description of the people running around with lights, sort of like oil lamps or something, helping people to find their way home and whatever. Remember, it's Christmas Eve, and so this is really showing us where it says proffering their services, means literally offering their services, offering their help. So it's just reminding us of the kindness at Christmas time. Then we've also got this interesting bit where it starts, meanwhile the fog and darkness thicken so. Now I've already found out that the weather is pretty dismal. It's been described as foggy and dark and grey and so on. So here is just another example of pathetic fallacy. Now remember, that's where the weather reflects the mood. And obviously the fog and darkness is thickening, so it's going to be difficult to see. So we've got this idea of sight again, all right, that we had before, and this kind of idea of being metaphorically blind to what is going on. So you need to write up there or somewhere else on your sheet, metaphorically blind. And as we've discussed previously, it's this idea of being blind to the problems in society. For example, the suffering of the poor, or Scrooge being metaphorically blind to his own sort of unhappiness and isolation and loneliness, and how his greed really is the cause of that. So that's an interesting point to pick up. Then we start talking about the church. So it's describing this church, and it says that the bell of the church is peeping slyly down at Scrooge. Now this is really interesting because we've got this church sort of spying on Scrooge essentially. Now if you're peeping, that means looking, and a church bell doesn't have any eyes, so we know that that's a metaphor. But more than that, it's an object that's being given human characteristics, so it's personification. All right, I haven't got any space up here, so I'm just going to put an arrow going up there and put personification. Now remember, we're not going to get any marks for just writing about the techniques or the methods. We've got to talk about the effect. So we need to note down what we can infer from that. It sort of suggests this idea that Scrooge is being spied on, but the fact that he's sort of being spied on by the church kind of gives this idea that the church is judging him, or maybe it's not the church that's judging him, and it's God that's judging him. Now remember, we also want to try and make links within the text, so we can link that back to the fact that earlier on he was described as an old sinner. What he is doing is wrong. It's unchristian. And remember, Dickens really believed that to be a good Christian, it wasn't about just turning up to church on Sunday. It was about actually making sure that you followed through on your actions and you were kind and charitable. So let's look at this, the rest of this description of the church. So the church, that the bell is peeping slyly, and it says, out of a Gothic window in the wall, became invisible and struck the hours and quarters in the clouds with tremulous vibrations afterwards, as if its teeth were chattering in its frozen head up there. So the church itself becomes invisible. Now, hopefully you've sort of made that connection this because it's becoming hidden in the fog. So literally, the church is hidden in the bad weather, but metaphorically, even the church cannot be seen. So if we see this as a metaphor, it's saying the church can't be seen either. So in the same way that Scrooge is metaphorically blind, the church is hiding from its responsibilities. And what are the church's responsibilities? Well, to be kind and charitable. That's what we're saying Christianity is all about. So really the church has responsibilities towards the poor, to help the poor. So Dickens here is offering a little bit of a criticism on the church, and he's maybe saying that he thinks the church should do more. Remember, there was no welfare system, and the poor were dependent on the goodness of individual philanthropists, individual rich people, being charitable towards them, making donations to charities or supporting them in some way. So all of that is really important. So if we put a little note here, we can say Dickens is critiquing or criticising, if you'd like to write that instead, the church. Remember, if you need to pause the video at any point to get your notes down, then you can. So once it's talked about the people offering their services and then talk about church, we get to here. The cold became intense. In the main street at the corner of the court, some labourers were repairing the gas pipes and had lighted a great fire in a brazier. That's like almost like a barbecue essentially, round which a party of ragged men and boys were gathered, warming their hands and winking their eyes before the blaze in rapture. Now this is interesting because we've got a great fire, and that's in complete contrast to poor old Bob Cratchit, and we could say poor old Scrooge as well. And then we've got this party of ragged men and boys were gathered, warming their hands and winking their eyes before the blaze in rapture. Loads of really interesting words here. So the fire is described as great. It's describing the fire, which is a noun. So great must be an adjective. The word ragged to describe the men here, this adjective here, is reminding us that they are poor. But they are warming their hands, they're winking their eyes, so this almost bit here, this phrase is suggesting they're happy, and they're before this blaze of this great fire, and they're in rapture, so they're kind of spellbound by this fire. So it's very positive, this image here, and actually what we're seeing is although they are poor, they are together, and they are happy, and they are warm. So this image of warmth here is really important. So here, if we're thinking about methods, we could say that it's imagery. Okay, this real important image, and this brings back well, it's sort of reinforcing some of these themes that are being introduced here of, I know they're not family, but this idea of family and togetherness and community and happiness and warmth. And it's also probably worth noting here that this is a really important contrast to Scrooge. They are poor, he is rich. They are happy, he is not. Scrooge is lonely, they are not. They are together. You get the idea. All right, so this is kind of quite an important image here about what Christmas time is all about as well. The water plug being left in solitudes, its overflowing suddenly congealed, had turned to misanthropic ice. Now that's just a nice reminder of Scrooge as well. Remember, he's misanthropic, he hates people. The brightness of the shops, where holly sprigs and berries crackled in the lamp heat of windows, made pale faces ruddy as they passed. Poulterers, that's like chicken sellers and grocers' trades became a splendid joke, a glorious pageant, with which it was next to impossible to believe that such dull principles as bargain and sale had anything to do. So all that's going on here is the scene, the shop windows are being described really, and they're saying that they're so beautifully decorated for Christmas that you can't believe that it's as boring as just selling things and making money. So it's really reminding us of the joy that Christmas brings. So let's have a look at some of the language there that does that. The shops are bright. They've got holly sprigs in. They've got berries, kind of this sort of symbol of colour. They're crackling. So we've got really beautiful verb here that's really suggesting life and action. And it actually has a physical impact on the people. And they go from being pale-faced to ruddy, made their pale faces ruddy. So remember, ruddy means red. And hopefully that word is reminding you of Fred, because that's where we saw it last. So I'm not going to write loads of notes, but you can if you wish. You might need to write them at the bottom of the page. But we can look at the kind of positive impact that Christmas has, and the kind of life and joy that it brings to London. And remember, this also seems to really contrast with at the beginning where it said, meanwhile the fog and darkness thicken so. And now we've got lamp heat. So the lights that people have got in their window. Okay, then it moves on to talking about the Lord Mayor. The Lord Mayor in the stronghold of the mighty mansion house gave orders to his 50 cooks and butlers to keep Christmas as a Lord Mayor's household should, and even the little tailor, whom he had fined 5 shillings on the previous Monday for being drunk and bloodthirsty in the streets, stirred up tomorrow's pudding in his garret, that's kind of like an attic, while his lean wife and baby sallied out to buy the beef. So we've got a bit of juxtaposition here. This contrast, remember that's what juxtaposition means, so that's what you need to write down here. Contrast between the rich and the poor. But essentially, although these people are being juxtaposed, we've got this contrast. Essentially, the idea here is that everybody is celebrating Christmas together. So again, this juxtaposition of rich and poor says actually at Christmas time, Christmas brings everybody together. Everybody celebrates it together. And particularly if we look at this last image, the little tailor, who is in his garret in comparison to the Lord Mayor's mansion, who was sort of misbehaving, he was drunk and bloodthirsty in the streets and got fined, is now preparing for Christmas. So again, I guess the inference here, the message is that Christmas brings out the good in everybody, even those people who maybe previously have sort of misbehaved, I guess. And again, that might remind us of that line, hard and sharp as flint, in stave 1, at the beginning of stave 1, where it's kind of making that suggestion that even in Scrooge, the kind of most negative, pessimistic character there could possibly be, even he has this little hint of goodness, just like the tailor sort of turns kind at Christmas time. Foggier yet, and colder, piercing, searching, biting cold. If the good St. Dunstan had but nipped the evil spirit's nose with a touch of such weather as that, instead of using his familiar weapons, then indeed he would have roared to lusty purpose. The owner of one scant young nose, gnawed and mumbled by the hungry cold, as bones are gnawed by dogs, stooped down at Scrooge's keyhole to regale him with a Christmas carol, but at the first sound of God bless you, merry gentlemen, may nothing you dismay, Scrooge seized the ruler with such energy of action that the singer fled in terror, leaving the keyhole to the fog and even more congenial frost. So we've made notes on this before. Last time we've got the carol singer who turns up at Scrooge's keyhole, sort of sings through the door, and Scrooge just reacts with violence and aggression to the point that the carol singer runs away. And this is really symbolising Scrooge's anger at the world, and how unhappy he is. He pushes everybody away. So just the same way that he pushes away Fred, he's now pushing away the carol singer too. And you know, if you know the story already, in the same way really that's what ends up happening with Belle and why they don't get married, isn't it? That he you know, money takes over him. At length the hour of shutting up the counting house arrived. With an ill will Scrooge dismounted from his stool, and tacitly admitted to the fact the expectant clerk in the tank, who instantly snuffed his candle out and put on his hat. "You'll want all day to-morrow, I suppose," said Scrooge. "If quite convenient, sir." "It's not convenient," said Scrooge, "and it's not fair. If I was to stop half-a-crown for it, you'd think yourself ill-used, I'll be bound." The clerk smiled faintly. "And yet," said Scrooge, "you don't think me ill-used when I pay a day's wages for no work." The clerk observed that it was only once a year. So we don't really need to make a huge amount of notes. If you want to remind yourself here, this quotation is saying that Scrooge doesn't really want to give Bob a day off for Christmas. Then that's fine, and you can add those notes there. But I think that bit's quite self-explanatory in terms of meaning. All right, let's move on to the top of page 7. Okay, so top of page 7 now. "A poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December," said Scrooge, buttoning his greatcoat to the chin. "But I suppose you must have the whole day. Be here all the earlier next morning." So it's interesting here that Scrooge feels like he's having his is being pickpocketed. He's having money stolen from him by letting his worker have one day off at Christmas time and still pay him. So it shows very much that he's not entering into the Christmas spirit. The clerk promised that he would, and Scrooge walked out without a growl. The office was closed in a twinkling, and the clerk, with his long ends of his white comforter dangling below his waist, for he boasted no greatcoat. Remember, this is a sort of symbol of Bob's poverty. He's just got this sort of big scarf to wrap round him, but actually it's almost a kind of symbol of his sort of warmth and comfort, that despite not having a coat, he's got this big blanket almost to keep him warm and protect him, I guess. It could almost be sort of symbolic. This blanket sort of protects him from Scrooge's meanness. That might be a nice point to just note there, because the comforter does get mentioned. So this white comforter is like a big scarf. So on one hand, it's sort of literally reminding us, the kind of literal meaning is reminding us that he's got no coat because he's poor, and so therefore he is cold. But actually, sort of metaphorically, it's suggesting warmth and comfort and happiness. And it's literally a kind of, I'm going to put a barrier or a protective layer against Scrooge's harsh treatment. So he kind of wraps himself up in that, and then, you know, seems to be able to prevent himself from getting sucked into Scrooge's miserly attitude. So dangling below his waist, for he boasted no greatcoat, went down a slide on Cornhill at the end of a lane of boys 20 times in honour of it being Christmas Eve, and then ran home to Camden Town as hard as he could pelt to play at Blind Man's Buff. So, you know, all these references to him having fun despite Scrooge's meanness. Okay, so just draw a line out here. Because this is a separate bit then, I think, really. I always think of this as a separate section. It says, Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern. This is kind of like an inn or a pub, I guess. And having read all the newspapers and beguiled the rest of the evening with his banker's book, went home to bed. And this is where it moves to him being at home. Now, I think this is a really important quotation here, not least because of the repetition of this word melancholy. And this is where we start to see that actually Dickens wants us to sympathise with Scrooge. This idea that he's kind of sad and depressing, this word adjective means. So he has a kind of sad and lonely dinner in this sort of sad and depressing place. He's on his own and it's Christmas Eve, and then he reads the newspapers, and then what he has for company is his banker's book, and then he goes to bed. And so this image here is such a strong image of his loneliness. And his isolation from the world. He's stuck in this routine of being on his own. He lived in chambers which had once belonged to his deceased partner. Okay, so he lives in a building that used to belong to Jacob Marley. So he's so tight with his money, he won't even buy his own money. They were a gloomy suite of rooms in a lowering pile of building up a yard, where it had so little business to be that one could scarcely help fancying it must have run there when it was a young house playing at hide and seek with other houses, and forgotten the way out again. So even the house that Scrooge lives in, Dickens is describing it as if it were a child that was once playing a game of hide and seek, and it ran down this sort of alleyway, and then it kind of forgot to ever come out again, or it got lost. So even the house that he lives in doesn't seem to fit in. Okay, so I'm trying to think what would be the best bit. Where it had so little business to be is probably your best quotation there, to say that even Scrooge's house doesn't fit in. So just like Scrooge, the house is an outsider in its community. It was old enough now and dreary enough, for nobody lived in it but Scrooge, the other rooms being all let out as offices. So even where he lives, no other people live there. So he's isolated even in his own home because no one else lives there. It's just workers. And again, this reinforces this idea that work is his life. That's all he has. The yard was so dark that even Scrooge, who knew its every stone, was fain to grope with his hands. The fog and frost so hung about the black old gateway of the house that it seemed as if the genius of the weather sat in mournful meditation on the threshold. So again, we've got this kind of pathetic fallacy. The house is dark and the fog and the frost are building up. Now it is a fact that there was nothing at all peculiar about the knocker on the door, except that it was very large. So remember, we're at the house now. Scrooge just stood at his front door. He's not going to knock on his own door with the door knocker, but he's sort of staring into it. It is also a fact that Scrooge has seen it night and morning during his whole residence in that place. Also that Scrooge had as little of what is called fancy about him as any man in the city of London, even including, which is a bold word, the corporation, aldermen, and livery. Let it also be borne in mind that Scrooge had not bestowed one thought on Marley since his last mention of 7 years dead partner that afternoon. And then let any man explain to me, if he can, how it happened that Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker, without its undergoing any immediate process of change, not a knocker, but Marley's face. Okay, so this is where we get our first mention of the ghost of Marley. Now you can either write it here, but I often find it helpful to write these things at the top of the page. So when I'm flicking through, I can find them more easily. So you can move back up here. You might want to write it really big because you've got the space. To remind yourself that this is where Marley's ghost starts coming in. All right, so here's our first mention of Marley, not a knocker, but Marley's face. Okay, so you can put it here, Marley's ghost. Marley's face. It was not an impenetrable shadow as the other objects in the yard were, but had a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. It was not angry or ferocious, but looked as Scrooge and Marley used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned upon its ghostly forehead. The hair was curiously stirred as if by breath or hot air, and though the eyes were wide open, they were perfectly motionless. That and its livid colour made it horrible, but its horror seemed to be in spite of the face and beyond its control, rather than a part of its own expression. As Scrooge looked fixedly at this phenomenon, it was a knocker again. To say that he was not startled, or that his blood was not conscious of a terrible sensation to which it had been a stranger from infancy, would be untrue. But he put his hand upon the key he had relinquished, turned it sturdily, walked in, and lighted his candle. He did pause with a moment's irresolution before he shut the door, and he did look cautiously behind it first, as if he half expected to be terrified with the sight of Marley's pigtail sticking out into the hall. But there was nothing on the back of the door except the screws and nuts that held the knocker on, and so he said "Pooh-pooh," and closed it with a bang. So just so that we're really clear about what's going on here, he looks behind the door. So there's a certain amount of uncertainty, okay, because he does look behind the door. He's not quite sure what it is that he's seen. The sound resounded through the house like thunder. Every room above and every cask in the wine merchant's cellars below appeared to have a separate peal of echoes of its own. Scrooge was not a man to be frightened by echoes. He fastened the door and walked across the hall and up the stairs slowly too, trimming his candle as he went. So he's just closed the door with a bang here. So what we get in this paragraph is echoes of the door banging. Okay, so it's not been really a lot to write on that page. I'm going to stop here and then I'll make another video looking at pages 8 and 9. All right.